Today I'll be sharing some of the results from my thesis research, which is on producer perspectives towards wetland retention and restoration contracts in the Canadian prairies. And the research examines producer preferences for the design of wetland conservation contracts. Sorry. So many of the wetlands in the prairies are located on private farmland, and they can compete with agricultural production, which often shifts private incentives to favor production over conservation. But wetland conservation agreements can help secure conservation on private lands, though they depend on participation to be successful. So the main objective of this research was to assess how conservation contract attributes affect producer participation and compensation requirements for wetland retention and restoration agreements. The data for this study came from a survey of prairie crop producers, and we got 601 complete responses. 201 were in Alberta, 212 in Saskatchewan, and the other 188 were from Manitoba. The survey included a discrete choice experiment, which provides the basis for evaluating producer preferences over contract attributes. In the choice experiment, each respondent was presented with 3 retention and 3 restoration scenarios. And in each scenario, they were asked to choose between 2 contracts or an opt-out option. And you can see right here is an example of a choice set that we would have presented producers with. So the contracts were varied across 5 different attributes: the size of the contract, the duration of the contract, whether or not there would be penalties for early termination, and those would be set at double the payments received if they were present. We also had whether or not agricultural activity was permitted, and of course the annual per acre payment for each contract. So this design allowed us to estimate how producers value specific components of conservation contracts and look at what trade-offs they were willing to make. So we estimated 2 types of econometric models: multinomial logit and latent class models. The multinomial logit models capture average preferences, and those are the models that we use to look at some differences across provinces, so to explore regional variation. And the latent class models were estimated to capture preference heterogeneity by identifying segments of producers that have distinct preference structures. So both types of models were estimated separately for retention and restoration agreements. That's to account for any differences in preferences that relate to contract type. So before I get into the econometric results, I just thought it would be good to look at what producers reported about past wetland management decisions. I think it provides some context for explaining the econometric results. So we also asked some other questions in addition to the choice experiment in the survey, and that's where all of these numbers come from. So starting with conversion, we found that 10% of respondents in our sample had converted wetlands to production in the last 5 years. And interestingly, the share in Saskatchewan was about twice as high as in the other 2 provinces, which could suggest something about incentives, like maybe there's stronger incentives to convert right now, or something about enabling conditions that are leading to higher rates of conversion in the province. We also asked producers about their previous drainage activities. And just to clarify, unlike the conversion question, there was no timeline on this question, so it could have occurred at any time. And roughly a quarter of the respondents had drained wetlands at some point. The share that had drained wetlands was higher in Manitoba, a little bit, than in the other 2 provinces. Manitoba producers also did report lower average drainage costs, so that likely contributed to the higher drainage share in the province. And then in terms of conservation actions, we found that 62% of the producers in our sample had retained wetlands, while restoration was far less common, with 11% having restored wetlands. But that's kind of what we expected, since retention doesn't necessarily require any action, but restoration typically does. So it kind of makes sense that that would be higher. Um, we also asked producers their reasons for having drained, retained, or restored wetlands. And we found that both drainage and conservation decisions were largely driven by financial considerations. So producers drained wetlands mainly to increase farmable acres, reduce overlap and nuisance costs, and to address low yields near wetlands. Whereas they were often retained or restored when the expected gains from production or drainage didn't justify the costs. So drainage was too costly or not worthwhile, or yields near wetlands were too low, and not necessarily because of wetland benefits. So this suggests that some retained wetlands could be at risk if the benefits of drainage increase. And similarly, that restoration is less likely when the benefits of production are higher. Another thing worth noting, conservation payments rarely played a role in conservation decisions. I think it was about 9% of producers selected conservation payments as a reason for having retained or restored wetlands, which could suggest that the current program incentives might not be compelling enough for a lot of producers. So now we'll get into the econometric results, and these are the results from the latent class analysis, which looks at heterogeneity and producer preferences. And these models were estimated at the prairie level. So this includes all of the provinces, and these kind of hold for like across each province. So the latent class models identified two classes of producers that have distinct preference structures in both retention and restoration contracts. Producers are more likely to have preferences aligning with class one than class two. Each respondent is roughly a 64% probability of being in class one for retention and 62% for restoration. Producers in this class, they have a positive baseline preference for retention and a neutral baseline preference for restoration. And what that means, a positive baseline preference means that producers would prefer to enroll in a contract relative to maintaining the status quo of not participating. And neutral baseline preference just means that they don't really have a strong preference either way towards participating or not. So class one producers exhibit relatively high acceptance rates and low compensation needs, even for more restrictive agreements. And class two producers are the smaller segment. There's about 36% probability of belonging to class two for retention and 38% for restoration. And these producers have a negative baseline preference, meaning that they prefer not to participate unless sufficiently incentivized. So one of the main differences between these classes of producers is that one is positive towards participation and would prefer to enroll. The other class is negative and would prefer not to enroll. So class two producers, they just have to be sufficiently incentivized basically to consider participating. And they show pretty low acceptance rates and high compensation needs, especially when contracts become more restrictive. And on the next two slides, I'll show you some more detail on how different the classes look in terms of their actual participation rates and required compensation, and differences in how they value contract attributes. So these are the results for retention contracts, and I'll just kind of explain. There's a lot of numbers here. So on the left-hand side, these are estimated participation rates and overall compensation requirements. And this is split by the least restrictive contract. So with the least restrictive contract we offered in the experiment. So that would be for 1 acre, would have no penalties for early termination, would permit agricultural activity, and would be 5 years in duration. Whereas the most restrictive contract would be 10 acres, would have penalties for early termination, would not allow agricultural activity in the basin, and would have a 40-year term. And just one thing to note about the compensation estimate, some of them are negative, which seems kind of odd. In this context, that implies that many producers would participate without compensation. So essentially, it means they would retain the wetlands anyway, whether they participated in a program or not. So as well, the likelihood of acceptance values, they show the likelihood of a producer participating in a contract versus maintaining the status quo, so not participating. And these are calculated for the highest payment amount we offered, so $60 per acre, and also at the lowest payment we offered, which is $60 per acre, and the highest is $490 per acre. Okay, so for class one producers, under the least restrictive terms, about 90% would participate even at the lowest payment. And you can see the compensation requirement is a large negative, indicating that many would retain wetlands without any compensation, which aligns with the pretty high participation rate at the low payment level. And then looking under the most restrictive terms, still over half would participate even at the lowest payment, and about 80% at the highest. The compensation requirements are still negative here, but much smaller, which would indicate there's a larger proportion of producers that would require compensation to participate, which you can also see from the increase of about 20 percentage points in participation when the payment rises to 490 per acre. And class two is kind of a different story. So under the least restrictive contract, class two, few producers would accept at the lowest payment. That does rise quite a bit to about 62% at the highest payment. But under the most restrictive contract, class two producers are essentially out of the market for conservation contracts and the payment range offered. And you can see that's because they require about $1,200 per acre per year to consider participating, whereas the highest we offered was less than half of that. So the chart on the right-hand side here shows producers' marginal willingness to accept for contract attributes. And this basically shows the influence of individual attributes on the overall compensation requirements. So it's essentially the sum of these contributes to the overall required compensation. So a positive marginal willingness to accept value would indicate that additional compensation is needed to accept a less desirable feature. And a negative would mean that a lower level of compensation is for like more of a desirable feature. So you can see here that contract size didn't have any significant influence on producer preferences. So basically, regardless of size, you'd be paying the same per acre annual payment. Um, Penalty estimates show the amount extra that a producer would require for a contract with a penalty versus one without. And activity estimates show the amount less a producer would require if they were allowed to conduct agricultural activity in the basin. And then these here are the duration estimates. So these are all relative to a 40-year agreement. And they show the amount less a producer would require in compensation if a contract is less than 40 years. So one notable thing too about the duration estimates for retention is there's no significant difference in annual compensation requirements for a 25 versus a 40-year retention contract. So that would mean basically that both lengths of contract could be secured at the same per acre annual cost. So I guess if the goal was longer term enrollment, you could basically offer a 40-year contract and expect to pay the same price as a 25-year. And just looking to compare across classes and how they value attributes, duration and activity estimates are pretty similar. They seem to value these quite similarly. However, you can see that penalty estimates are a little bit higher for this group, meaning that they would charge more of a premium for penalties if they were included in a contract. So essentially, the results show it's largely the difference in baseline preferences that's driving the differences in likelihood of participation and compensation requirements between classes. Though penalties do play a bit of a role, but that would only really be in the most restrictive contract. So looking at the results for the restoration contracts next, just one thing to note Um, for restoration in the survey, producers were told that the government or conservation agency responsible for the contract would cover all of the direct restoration costs. So producers were only evaluating their willingness to set aside the land and maintain the restored wetland. Not the doesn't include the cost of physically restoring it. So basically, if producers were also responsible for the restoration costs, you would expect to see, or I would expect the compensation requirements to likely be higher than what's presented here. And you can see restoration follows the same general two-class structure as retention, but the differences between classes are a little more pronounced. So for class one producers, under the most restrictive contract, about 86% would participate at the lowest payment. And compensation requirements are similarly to retention, a large negative. So many producers would be willing to maintain a restored wetland without having any compensation. Whereas under the least restrictive terms, about half would still participate at the lowest payment and about 80% at the highest. The compensation requirement here under the most restrictive contract is positive, but it's a pretty modest payment, about $90 per acre per year, though it is higher than for retention. So for class two producers, under the least restrictive contract, acceptance rates are relatively low, only 16% at the lowest payment, but it does increase to 42% at the highest. So they are somewhat responsive to payment increases in the range we offered for the least restrictive contract. And similarly to for retention, the class two producers are also essentially out of the market for restrictive restoration agreements within the payment range that we offered in the survey. And you can see that's because they require a much higher level of compensation. So the highest we offered was about 500, and they would require about 2,000 per acre per year to consider participating in a restoration agreement, which was almost twice as much as what they required for retention. So you can see values are a little bit higher. Restoration might be a little costlier than retention, and that's not including, obviously, the costs associated with restoring the wetland. And looking at the marginal willingness to accept for restoration contract attributes, this helps explain kind of what's driving some of these differences. So again, it is largely the baseline preferences that drives these differences, especially for the least restrictive contract where there's not including any of the attributes that some of them require a lot more compensation for than others. Um, so you can see that class two producers here are very sensitive to contract length. So basically, they would offer pretty large discount for a 5-year contract relative to a 40-year, over $700 per acre per year. But once you get beyond 5 years, the 10, 25, and 40-year estimates are not significantly different from one another, which would suggest that the longer agreements are all roughly equally as costly. So essentially, you get a large discount for 5 years, but 10, 25, and 40-year, you would pay basically the same per acre annual payment to class two producers. Class one producers do still provide, they would still accept lower payments for any duration less than 40 years. You can also see that for penalties and for activity restrictions, class two producers do charge larger premiums to accept these attributes. I should mention these are so they go both ways. So if you think of this as like the discount for 5-year versus 40-year, it's also the premium for 40-year versus 5-year. So they're symmetric. You can kind of interpret them either way. Um, and class two producers do tend to require more compensation to accept more restrictive terms in restoration than they do in retention, whereas class one producers require about the same, regardless of contract type. So basically, that just shows the gap between classes is larger for restoration than retention, and particularly when there's more restrictive terms. So essentially, the restoration results are very similar to the retention findings, just that class two producers are a little more sensitive to restrictive agreements, and that's led to some wider differences between class preferences. So overall, the latent class results, they show that for both retention and restoration, programs would either need to offer very flexible terms or substantial payments if they wanted to secure participation from class two producers, in particular if they wanted to secure restrictive restoration contracts. And they also show that higher compensation is generally required for restoration than retention contracts. And the next slide I'll get to just summarizes some of the differences we saw in provincial preferences across provinces. So we used multinomial logit models just to look at kind of the average preferences and see if we could see any general trends in acceptance rates and compensation needs and producer preferences over attributes across provinces. And the compensation ranges I've listed here. So the low end is the least restrictive contract, and the high end would be for the most restrictive contract. So out of the producers in the three provinces, Alberta producers consistently had the highest acceptance rates and the lowest compensation needs for both retention and restoration. Um, and their preferences were similar for both contract types. And you can see compensation needs are very similar for retention and restoration. Many Alberta producers would be willing to participate in the least restrictive contract for no compensation. They require pretty modest compensation, especially compared to the other provinces, to accept more restrictive terms in either contract type. In terms of attribute preferences, Alberta producers tend to be the least sensitive to longer contract terms amongst the provinces. They also don't penalize for early termination penalties in retention. So basically, having a penalty for early termination doesn't affect participation or compensation needs for a retention contract, though it does for restoration. And looking at Saskatchewan producers, um, they are more likely to participate and require less compensation for restoration than retention. And they also have the highest compensation needs for retention across provinces. And that pattern is largely driven by a strong sensitivity to contract length for retention among Saskatchewan producers. They're also very sensitive to penalties in retention, more so than in restoration. And as we saw earlier, Saskatchewan producers also had the highest rate of recent wetland conversion. So I think these results do support the conclusion that there might be something going on there with incentives to convert. Maybe they are quite strong right now. Um, and then looking at Manitoba producers, they have similar participation rates and compensation needs for both contract types on average, though compensation becomes somewhat higher for restrictive restoration than retention. So they might have a slight preference towards retention versus restoration. And Manitoba producers are particularly sensitive to activity restrictions and longer terms in restoration contracts. And that might suggest that they perceive the opportunity costs of long-term restoration enrollment higher than they do for retention. So I'm not going to go into the super detailed numbers and slides about the provincial analysis. That would be a little too much, I think. So just to summarize the main results. So across the analysis, higher payments increase acceptance, as we would have expected. As well, shorter terms and flexible contract features are consistently preferred, again, as we would have expected. Though it is interesting that contract size has a limited influence within the range of contracts offered in the study, and that might just be related to the farm sizes in the sample, which were relatively large versus the contract sizes that we offered. Um, so maybe you would see more of those sizes for smaller or more of an impact for smaller farms. As well, retention generally has higher acceptance and lower compensation for more restrictive contracts when you're looking at the prairie level. And the latent class results, they show that different producers value contracts differently. The larger class has relatively high acceptance and low compensation needs, while the smaller class has low acceptance and high compensation needs, especially for restrictive contracts. And that means that expected participation and compensation needs will not just depend on the contract design itself, but also on the types of producers that a program is trying to reach. At the provincial level, Alberta stands out as having the highest acceptance and lowest compensation needs for both contract types. Saskatchewan for its strong aversion to long-term agreements and also for having the highest compensation needs for retention. And Manitoba producers are a bit more sensitive to restrictive terms for restoration than they are to retention. And so some of the implications for program design, um, contracts that are shorter, easier to exit, and allow compatible agricultural activity can improve participation and lower compensation needs, though there's clearly a trade-off between program flexibility and obviously the level of wetland protection a program secures. So I guess that's the balance of what are the goals of the program and of course the budget and what level of participation are you hoping to secure. The results also suggest that uh, uniform pricing might is unlikely to be cost effective given this substantial heterogeneity in producer preferences. It may not be the most efficient approach. Pricing for, if you were priced for the lower compensation class, you'd be unlikely to attract any producers from the higher compensation class. But if you set general compensation for the higher compensation class, then you would also be paying those other producers a lot more to retain a restore wetland than would be necessary. Um, these results also show that retention might be more cost effective than restoration, unless, of course, like the ecosystem service benefits of restoration were higher and justified the added cost. And there's also some implications for provincially tailoring. So if you were hoping for higher acceptance and lower payments, shorter terms in Saskatchewan would make a big difference. Manitoba producers would likely require higher premiums for restoration than for retention. And you could include penalties in Alberta contracts for retention without really incurring any higher compensation or reducing the likelihood of participation. Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Ashley, for that overview. And we'll give you a round of applause for that. And if you want to just keep your slides there in case people have any specific questions, that would be helpful too. So look at those. Look at those hands just rising. That makes me
Mhm.
feel great this morning, Ashley. So yeah, thank you so much for that. And maybe I'll just say I just find it encouraging and exciting to see some of this more detailed analysis on that great question of wetland conservation and engaging with producers on the landscape. And so it's great at that angle, and I think too to see new generations of conservationists coming through and doing great work is nice. And I also know there's a number of implementers or policy related folks on this call as I see the name. And I know that you'll have some good questions, I think, of the implications of what this means for some of your own work and program design, as Ashley said. One thing I'll maybe add too is that fascinating that this was through the generous support of Environment and Climate Change Canada through this project, Wetlands as Natural Solutions. So the baselines and projections for wetlands on agricultural land in Western Canada, but also there's partners with Ontario and Quebec too.